Welcome to Leader U by Black River Performance Management, where we believe work should fuel the human spirit, not drain it. In this leadership podcast, we will dive into the lived experiences of people flourishing in today's workplace and beyond. Join us to hear real-life examples of experiences from our own lives and from the leaders we know and trust. All right, thank you for listening to the Leader U podcast. Today, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Alex Bolinger. He is the ICCU, that's Idaho Central Credit Union for those of you non-Idahoans, Endowed Professor of Management at Idaho State University. He earned his Ph.D. in Management from the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah and teaches classes on leadership, negotiation, and decision-making. Bolinger's research focuses on team dynamics, leadership, and entrepreneurship, and has appeared in the Harvard Business Review and Academy of Management Review, among other outlets. He's an advocate of active approaches to learning. Students in his classes have raised over $10,000 for the Make-a-Wish Foundation of Idaho, have worked in teams to write multiple popular press books about the histories of local organizations, and have taken home more than a dozen trophies from the International Collegiate Business Strategy Competition in Anaheim, California. Bolinger is a three-time finalist of ISU's Outstanding Faculty Awards for Teaching, Research, and Service. He has been named ISU Professor of the Year by the Associated Students of Idaho State. Thank you for being on the podcast today, Alex. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you about negotiation, since it is one of the leadership competencies we help people to develop. And this podcast is specifically designed to give free access of tidbits, wisdom, and just some real help in people being able to build those skills. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for this invitation. Excited to join you.
Yeah. So do you want to start off with just sharing your story of how, the basics that take you from how you got to where you are today?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm from Southeast Idaho, grew up in American Falls, so had the chance to go to ISU, majored in management there, and got my MBA at ISU, and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next, and had some really influential professors in the College of Business who really enjoyed what they were doing and seemed to be making a real impact in the community. And so I thought that sounded like a lot of fun, and eventually kind of made my way to the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah, as you mentioned, got my PhD in management, and then started my career in the Penn State system, the Penn State Brandywine campus just outside of Philadelphia. So I had the chance to teach back east, and that was interesting and fun. And then an opportunity opened at ISU, and it was sooner than I expected, but the person I was would be the job that was opening, the person had been there for 35 years, which gives you a sense for what a great job it is at ISU. And so I thought if it's going to be another 35 years, I better throw my hat into the ring, and was able to get the job, and the rest is history.
Nice. So how long have you been back in Southeast Idaho teaching at ISU?
Just a little over a decade now.
Okay. That's some time. Got some time under your belt. Have had a lot of students.
Indeed, yeah.
All right, so let's get into the story about what your thoughts are on negotiation. When you're teaching classes, when you're working with industry, what are some of the key things that you're teaching your students on that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things to acknowledge to start with, and this is something I've learned over the years with, as you mentioned, so many groups of students who've come through my classes, negotiation is not necessarily something that everyone takes to. And in fact, it can kind of be an intimidating thing, right? Because it often, I think people associate it with difficult conversations and with conflict and a lot of the things that we like to tend to avoid. And yet, boy, as a leader, you have to negotiate, right? I mean, that's a part of the job. And so one of the things we talk about are, first off, acknowledging that discomfort, right? And recognizing that some people might be more open to that initially than others. And then, so after sort of recognizing that, then saying, okay, what are some ways that we can frame negotiation in terms of its productive potential? And we talk about negotiation really sort of in three different ways. It's a way to resolve disputes. So when there are conflicts, it's often with the assistance of a mediator, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to get better deals, which I think is what oftentimes we associate negotiation with. And then the third is it's a way to manage interdependencies. And in any organizational setting, you're going to be interdependent with others, right? And so it's a way, rather than you versus me, it's a way that we can collectively make decisions. And I think framing negotiation from that perspective makes it a lot less intimidating,
Mm-hmm.
because it's no longer you and me across the table, but rather we're on the same side of the table trying to reach an agreement that's a win for both of us.
Right, absolutely. I do think there is a kind of a stereotype of it being a difficult conversation, like you said, or it's going to be aggressive, it's going to be uncomfortable. And it is if you haven't really built the skills. Anything that you haven't worked on is going to be a challenge. Just like if you were playing tennis, you'd be not very good out on the court your first day, right? But
Right.
working through some of these things and getting some tips on how to, well, one of the things that I see negotiation is needing some emotional intelligence skills. You really have to be able to understand yourself and how you're coming across, and then read the room, understand body language, figure out what this person, if they are upset or these kinds of things, so that you can kind of adapt and be empathetic in certain situations, looking for that win-win instead of the ego coming out and being like, it's me or you, me versus you. There's got to be a loser. It's a winner or a loser situation.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And there's a lot of research now on the effects of emotions in negotiation, and I think a lot of concern around, for example, when I think a lot of times the stereotype of the tough negotiator is the person who comes in and strategically shows anger to try to win concessions from the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're right. Part of sort of being able to counteract that is to come in and say, well, what's underlying that emotion? Is this strategic on their part? Is it that they're sincerely angry? And if so, kind of what's the root of that?
Mm-hmm.
And then to be able to tackle the problem rather than it becoming about the personalities, right? So
Right.
just being able to set that piece aside.
Yeah. So, what are some of the things you talk about, like strategically coming up with multiple scenarios that the person, so that there's not just one or two solutions? There's got to be a lot of different solutions or ways of solving a problem instead of it's white or black.
Right, absolutely. Well, and to your point, I think one of the biggest takeaways from my classes, that I try to share with my students is that probably 80 to 90% of negotiation success happens before you sit down across the table, right? Or on the phone or whatever it would be
Mm-hmm.
in today's age, right? When you're negotiating.
Yeah.
It has to do with the preparation that you do going into the negotiation. And we talk about that in multiple different ways. One of the key things to recognize is what we call your BATNA. It's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And really what that means is if I can't reach an agreement in this negotiation, what's my next best alternative? What do I have to fall back on?
Mm-hmm.
And that's important because that gives you a sense for how hard you can push, how much power you've got in that negotiation. It also gives you a better sense. You can start to build ideas around, like you said, right? What are the different ways in which, what are different outcomes that would achieve the goal that I'm looking for, right? And are there sort of multiple ways of getting there? And you can't know that unless you know where the win is.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that takes some preparation before you even sit down to the table.
Right. And I would have to say that listening is a skill that's super important in negotiation, because you really need to hear what the person wants and is needing and what's important to them. And that's a skill that also needs work for most of us. A lot of
Oh,
times we're listening to respond instead of actually listening to find out what's important to that person and what they need to get out of it.
for sure. Well, and it's interesting too because oftentimes in negotiations, people tend to play their cards a little bit close to the vest, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe a lack of trust just because of the way that it's seen as kind of an adversarial situation. And so, not only in terms of listening, right? It's not only hearing what they're saying, but also thinking through what are the kinds of questions I need to ask for them to be comfortable enough to share at least enough information that we can start to get at mutual solutions, right? So yeah, asking the right questions, listening to the answers, and sincerely listening, like you said, rather than just sort of using it as a pause before you make your next point. Those are critical skills.
Yeah. So being curious would be a skill for finding out more, finding out what's important, and actually maybe finding out where you both see the same things, or where do you connect, and where are you making connections and being able to, come to the table in an agreement at somewhere close to arrive at the same spot.
Right, for sure. And that's a point that I think sometimes gets overlooked with negotiation is that you have opportunities to create value when you have differences between the two sides, whether it's differences in your needs or differences in your perceptions of the situation or what have you, right? When there are those differences, then you have opportunities to reach agreements that where you can sort of trade on those and leverage them. And I think people sometimes forget that. They sort of say, oh, we're so different. There's no way we're going to be able to reach an agreement. And actually, I would argue that the more you can leverage those differences, the more likely you are to actually create value in that process.
Absolutely. One of the other things that I think is important is knowing that person's behavioral style, whatever kind you utilize, just being able to kind of read people and know if they're super direct. Like we use DISC, right? So I can tell right away if somebody's direct to the point, and if that's where they are, I would want to kind of meet them at that communication style, because that's their preferred communication style versus somebody that's maybe an S, that's a little slower paced, slower to change, going to need some time to think about it, wants it all in writing. So understanding who the person is and what their behavior, their preferred, kind of like their love language for communication, what that is very helpful in just thinking what your approach might be. Would you have any other tips like for approach and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, maybe just to comment on the point that you make, I think that's an incredibly important one. And certainly personality comes through when you've got face to face communication in a negotiation. Maybe even to take that a step further, right? There are also broader sort of cultural factors at play. Your example there reminds me of a story of negotiators working with cultures, for example, in the East, right, where um, there's a very different sort of time frame for negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain cultures where you have to sit down and have 2 or 3 meals with your counterpart before it would be considered appropriate to talk business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Building that relationship is just so critical. And coming from Western cultures, especially the United States, we tend to be real time focused and just get down to business, right? And that completely destroys any trust building opportunities that you would otherwise have.
I would, I can agree with that firsthand. I lived in Shanghai for a few years, uh, and it was one of those things where you had to learn to slow down. You had to do everything that would build face with the culture, with the people that you were working with, and you'd be needed want to eat some of the food that they did. Even if it was something you didn't like, you eat it. If they give you a shot, you drink it. Like, it's one of the things that you just do it, because there is no relationship if it's offensive if you don't go through these different processes. And so I love that you're bringing in the international piece where it depends on your audience who you're negotiating with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where, oftentimes international negotiations have run aground in the past. I think people are getting more sensitive to that as the world sort of gets smaller in some ways with communication and so forth.
Absolutely. So, what are some of the biggest negotiations you've got to be a part of that you've had some really great takeaways on?
So I'll tell you the thing that has been one of the most fulfilling parts of the class that I teach. So I teach, as you mentioned, an MBA class at ISU in the College of Business on negotiation and decision making. So it's
Mhm.
kind of a combined class, and it turns out that those two topics are very complementary because often negotiations are sort of the mechanism through which collective decisions happen. But the end requirement, the end assignment for that class is what we call a real world negotiation paper. And the assignment is to negotiate for something of value in the real world and then to write about it, applying the principles that we've talked about all semester in the class.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's been a lot of fun. And over the years, I think there have been dozens of homes that have been purchased and cars that have been purchased using sort of negotiated for with the skills from that class, job advancement, negotiating for new positions. Lots of people who are starting out, sort of going out into their careers or shifting to a new career or a different path. But interestingly enough, some of the most interesting negotiations are not nearly that sort of headline making. I've had negotiations with parents and small children, for example, over bedtime, or over between partners about who will do the dishes, those kinds of things. And what's
Where you want to
interesting,
eat, where we're going to eat.
right? Exactly, right? Yeah, yeah, stuff that seems kind of mundane and everyday. But what's interesting about it is that when you apply the principles of negotiation to those kinds of things, it takes you out of just sort of focusing on yourself, and there's sort of that broader focus on, okay, what's the win for the other person too, right? And a lot of people have said that's been a real beneficial thing, sort of personally, in addition to their professional lives.
Yeah, and it's a good place to start so that you can build it for the bigger things. Just starting small, those little baby steps, and with your kids, that's a great place to start negotiating, especially if you have toddlers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Every day is a negotiation.
Exactly. Who's going to dress you? All of those kinds of things. Well, what are some of the challenges that you see in negotiations? Besides
Yeah.
that it being difficult and what the perceptions about it.
Right. Yeah. Several. I mean, I could probably talk all day about different barriers that come up over the course of the class that we talk about these things. But I would say one of the big ones is sort of the way that so much communication now is electronically mediated. Right. It's one thing to negotiate face to face, but it's completely different when you're negotiating over the phone or now increasingly just via email. Right. It changes a lot of those dynamics, and it changes the way in which you can create trust. And so I think that that's one of the great challenges that people are experiencing now. So many negotiations, even 10, 15 years ago, were face to face or at least over the phone. And now increasingly you're negotiating with someone in much more impersonal terms. And so how do you foster that trust? How do you facilitate some of the things we talk about in a face-to-face context, but when you don't have sort of that social presence?
Absolutely. I've seen that in our business that sometimes we will meet with a client, find out their needs, do an assessment, like in a discovery call, figure out what would be some possible interventions and things, and then write up a proposal, and then it goes dark, right? So then you're like, you want to re-engage them, and maybe you're over their budget, maybe, whatever, probably most likely that's why they're not responding. But we're open to a negotiation and finding out how we can work with people. But I've noticed that oftentimes people aren't, when they see a price or they see, well, that's out of my price range, or they just stop and then they actually ghost you. And so
Right.
it's like, well, you're the leader of this company and you want some help. So come negotiate with us and let's talk about, or where could we start? What are some of the things that we could do to get you going this year? And like we could make a longer term plan. But sometimes I just don't see a lot of leaders willing to negotiate. They just see a price tag and they just think that's it. And it's not it. It's never
Right.
it. There's always room for negotiation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you're right, right? I mean, it's a different conversation if you were interacting with them face to face, right? You could see the look on their face if they're sort of, that look of resignation or whatever, and then you could follow up more proactively. So it does create some challenges. I will say this, one of the things that's been a really interesting development is about 7 years ago. So this class, my negotiation class, we do role plays in class, and historically we've always been face to face. And for example, it could be one person takes the role of a candidate for a job, and the other is the recruiter, and they're negotiating over 8 items to for this person to then be able to take that job, right? That kind of thing. But increasingly, about 7 years ago, we started offering the class also online synchronously via Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And I had all kinds of concerns about, my goodness, how is that going to change the dynamic? And it does change it. It's a different conversation slightly. I think it still helps to have, the better technology gets, the more it feels like you've got that social presence in person. But I think that you're right. I think that students have had to adjust. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's been really interesting to see the differences because I typically will teach one in-person class and also one section online via Zoom, sort of in the same semester.
Wow. That sounds like an amazing class. I know you have another class coming up we can talk about later too, because I think it's really a great class that would be helpful for anybody. Um, I'm thinking specifically, work with a lot of women's groups, and I do a lot of speaking for women's groups, and I know that negotiation is one of the topics that comes up a lot because women tend to be paid less in many organizations. I've had it happen to me where there's been a male in the role and it's like I have the same qualifications. I know many women who go through this. And so do you have any specific tips or even classes for women specifically when they're in a male dominated profession?
Yeah, and let me just sort of reinforce what you said. I think that's such an important point. Linda Babcock, about 15 years ago, wrote a book, and the title sort of says it all. Her thesis was "Women Don't Ask," and the idea was, right, that things that would be seen as normative for a man to ask about, to negotiate, would be seen differently if a woman sort of made the same ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there are absolutely challenges. I think that those norms are starting very slowly to shift a little bit, which
Mm-hmm.
is great news. They need to move faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, it does create a real dilemma. Um, one of the things I tell, especially when I'm talking to female students, and I think this is also true for any negotiator, but especially if you're sort of in that position, it's important to, as you make an ask, right, or as you are negotiating, to not let your offer speak for itself. So, in other words, right, it's not just to say, well, I want this in salary and this in benefits and so forth, but it's really important to communicate, I'm making this offer because, or I'm asking for this because I'm worth it, right? This is the value that I'm going to add to your company, value in terms of A, B, and C,
Mm-hmm.
right? And being very specific about that and reminding them that the value is associated with that, and making that connection and not just letting the offer speak for itself. I mean, it's important for anyone, but I think especially as women are sort of put in that position, I think it's especially important for them.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think one of the challenges is them seeing their worth. And when you don't feel the worth, then you don't want to ask for it. It's like,
Mhm.
well, this is just good enough, right? Like, or I guess this is the cards I'm always going to be dealt with. It's kind of a fixed mindset, really, of and I fell into it. I will have to tell you, in my 20s and early 30s, I was definitely a victim to it, but I allowed that. Not any longer. It took some years and some really hard mistakes where you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that again, because you find out later. You always find out what the other person's making that started with you or whatever. And so then you really start to advocate for yourself. And
Yeah.
I think that's a challenge for younger people as well, is just self advocacy. And so all of these pieces, negotiation has a lot of skills incorporated into it.
Yeah, and I think too, and this is something I'm so grateful that you and your organization do, are building this, is that I think mentorship is so incredibly important. Having someone who can provide that support and who can kind of be a mirror and say, hey, no, you do have value, and I see it, right? Even when
Yes,
you don't see it in yourself, that's incredibly important.
it is absolutely. And getting people with that experience to kind of walk alongside you and help you script the conversation. One of the things I do with some of my coaching clients is script out conversations, like a difficult conversation, a negotiation conversation, and get them comfortable with doing it with me first before they go to their boss or before they go to the next person, so that when they do go, they know it's been looked over by somebody that's non-biased and not emotionally attached to the situation. And so you can look and make sure they're having some diplomacy intact as they're doing the ask, because you also don't want to go in with attitude and I deserve it, and this kind of thing. It's more like, this is my worth. This is my why. This is the beliefs that I have, that this is why I'm asking for this much, and this is the value I'm going to add.
Yeah, I think that's so important. That's, in our classes with the role plays, one of the things I tell them is this is your opportunity to try things out without actually risking money, right? Or having the stakes on the table. And you can make mistakes, you can try different things. And like you said, it's a safe place to do that. And that's so important.
That's what I love about higher ed, is just a safe place to make mistakes, and with that, when the stakes are low. The
Right.
stakes are really low, and so you get to practice, fail, fail, fail. And you get it in the real world too. But one of the things I do think about negotiation is, if there's always a lose-lose situation, you are eventually going to lose that relationship. It will not maintain if there is never any kind of, whether that's a marriage or with your child or with a customer, anybody. If you gotta win, and this comes into ego, um, our ego always wants us to be right,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we'll
Absolutely.
right fight. We'll right fight just to. So whenever I always, when I feel myself, when I feel my ego coming up or burning up, just kind of like, ugh, I have to ask myself. I stop and I ask myself the question: do you want to be right, or do you want this relationship? And in
Yeah.
that space that I create there, just to check myself before I wreck myself, just, this is
Right.
not, I want this relationship. What's most important to me is the relationship, and we can try to figure out something for this person and something for me, but we might not both get exactly what we're looking for here.
Yeah, it's so true. Or you might get it in a way that you didn't maybe expect, right? Sort of initially. Um, to your point, and maybe this is building on it a bit, but I think this is worth mentioning. One of the things I do talk about is that not every negotiation will ultimately reach an agreement from both sides, right? There are some negotiations where there just the structure may not be aligned to where you're better off walking away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that and being able to do that on good terms, that's a whole skill set in and of itself.
It is in and of itself, right? Like, and being able to be okay with it, and
Yeah.
not have it keep you up at night forever, that like, this is sometimes how it is. Sometimes it's how life works.
Yeah.
So let's see, we have a little bit more time. Do you have some books or articles that you recommend as it relates to negotiation and even decision making, since those two are so closely related?
Yes, for sure. So one of my all-time favorite books on negotiation is called Getting to Yes.
Hmm.
And there's several authors. I should have the book in front of me. Should have brought it with me, but it's available, widely distributed. Very, very popular book. It's probably 30 years old now, so it's kind of timeless wisdom.
Hmm.
But the idea is very similar to what we've been talking about today. It's sort of saying, okay, where is the opportunity to create value, and how do you get to that point? And
Mm,
so it's a great overview of the fundamentals of negotiation in a very digestible, very accessible read.
nice.
So
Is that a good
yeah,
Audible? Some aren't that great on
yeah,
Audible.
yeah, that would be great. I assume it's available on Audible, and that would be a pretty easy listen.
Yeah,
So
awesome.
yeah. In terms of decision making, the book that I use is one of my textbooks is called Smart Choices.
Hmm.
It's from several authors who worked for the Harvard Business School, and it's a really nice framework. It's the framework that we use in my class for deciding among alternatives when those decisions are difficult or uncertain or involve risk or any of the above. Again, not a hard read, but very insightful. They really break things down in a way that's very accessible, and I've gotten feedback over the years that among the textbooks that students keep, that tends to be kind of at the top of their list.
Oh,
So
that's great. Great information. So tell us a little bit about the future leadership that you've got coming up.
Yes, thank you. So I'm really excited about this class. So this spring, we're going to be teaching an 8-week course, and it's going to be really dealing with kind of the situation that we find ourselves in, sort of societally, right?
Hmm.
This idea of, you what is work going to look like in the future,
Hmm.
and how is it that that future came so quickly, right? It's just, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been very disorienting in some ways. How quickly things seem to have changed with remote work, right? With
Hmm.
record low unemployment, the Great Resignation, which has been making headlines, quiet quitting, all of those themes, boomerang employees, and so forth. So, we're going to talk about each of those in turn, and we're going to talk a little bit about what leadership looks like and is going to look like in this new world. Um, the sort of feature of this class, and this is also something that we're just really excited about, in February, so February 15th and 16th, Dr. Anthony Klotz is going to be coming to Pocatello. He's a professor of management at University College in London, and he coined the term the Great Resignation
Hmm.
back at the beginning of the pandemic. He saw it coming and predicted sort of what has all played out, and has kind of become the go-to among media outlets in the business world. So if you see a business article on employment trends on CNN, or any CNBC, that kind of thing, he's probably one of the people that they'll reference or even interview. So it's amazing to have someone of that caliber coming to Pocatello. And he's going to give a master class to our students. And then we're also working out some details to see if he will be able to give a presentation to the public as well. So I'll know more details about that here in the next couple of weeks. So if anyone's interested in learning more, they can email me, and I'll be able to keep them posted on that.
Oh, that's so amazing. I wish I was going to be in town. I would totally take the class and I would be there. I'll be traveling the month of February, but I hope that our listeners, that they are, it's something that they'll be able to do as well. Are there any tips or wisdom that maybe some things that you wished you knew about negotiation when you were starting out?
Yeah, I think maybe three things that I would sort of give as sort of general advice, especially for someone like you said who's starting out. The first is to know where the win is for you, right? What does a good outcome look like?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of times, it's really easy to sort of go into a negotiation, but not really know what you're looking for, what you're hoping to get out of it, right? And if you have kind of a sense for that, then if the other side is able to offer you something that maybe isn't what you thought, but actually meets what you were hoping, right? Actually meets your goals in a different way, then you'll be able to identify that. So I think that's really important. I think it's also incredibly important to know what your alternatives are, right? And I talk to a lot of students who are just starting out on the job market, right? And one of the things we talk a lot about is, the more alternatives and the better your alternatives, the easier the negotiation is, and the more leverage you've got. And so we talk about things like, making sure that you cultivate opportunities, that you work with mentors, that you do a lot of the legwork long before you're actually interviewing with companies, so that you've got those opportunities, and continuing to cultivate those opportunities.
Absolutely.
And then, yeah, yeah. And then I think the final one, that's really important, is also to not sort of just settle for the best, or what's good enough, right? But also to think through to set a target, to set a goal, and to say, you know, this is um, this is something that would be a really nice outcome for me. And the reason that's important is that if you just sort of settle for something that is good enough, that gets you above your best alternative, let's say, it's not that that's bad, but you're probably leaving cash on the table, right? And so it's kind of this good enough, but then also better and best, and recognizing what those are, and hopefully moving closer to the best, right? And along that gradient.
Yeah, I think our brains really we don't know what we want. We have to really think about what we want. We all know what we don't want. And regardless if that's what to eat or where to go, we know, no, I'm not in the mood for that. I don't want that. But even the coaching clients I have, many times they don't know what they want. They don't know what done looks like. They don't know what best case scenario is. And that takes some time to reflect, and it takes work to think through what are some of the possible outcomes? What would I be satisfied with? And so I think sometimes we do just settle for like, yeah, that's better,
Right.
and so how do you get people to create a practice where they set some time aside to reflect and think through, create space when there's, you know,
Yeah.
competing things, competing time and all of this type stuff that gets in the way, the
Yeah.
barriers.
Oh yeah, it's a great question. It's a great point. One of the things we do in class, and I commend this to any negotiator, is I ask students to do a pre-negotiation strategy plan, and
Mm,
there are a series of bullet point questions that they're asked to fill out, and it might take maybe 20 to 30 minutes tops, as they're kind of preparing for each of the role plays that they do in class. But these are questions that have to do with, to your point, right? It's not just sort of what's your best alternative and what do you think the other party is going to do, but also what would a really good outcome look like to you, right? And what are some things, I mean, what are your goals? So it really sort of forces you to take that step back. And I think there's a real tyranny of the urgent, right?
hmm
I mean, the things that are urgent every day kind of crowd out the stuff that's super important, but sometimes you've just got to block out that time. And maybe an upcoming negotiation is that opportunity to sort of say, okay, I've got to block this into my calendar because this is crucial, and the rubber is going to meet the road here very quickly.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. I just remembered what I was going to say a little bit ago, and that was that a futuristic thinking is one of the leadership competencies that we discuss. And I have one podcast on here with Ron Price, who was one of my mentors, and he's the CEO of TTI Success Insights. And he talks about um, creating a practice of becoming more of a futuristic thinker, setting time in your schedule, doing all these types of things. And one of the books he recommends is The Future is Faster Than You Think. And
Mhm.
that's one that I listened to on Audible this past year. And there was some really crazy research going on and things that, and just things that you might not think about, just to like get your mind going about AI and all the things that are coming our way. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but he had some really great tips in that one on the future of leadership. And I really, really value his input. He's been a global leader and helped many organizations. That's what it was. It was related to that question. But um, if
That's
it if
great.
it's if
Yeah,
it's
no,
helpful,
I'm looking forward to reading that. And I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, that we don't know exactly where it's all going to go. I think we've all been taken by surprise these last 2 to 3 years. So I think that flexibility and versatility are going to be the names of the game when it comes to leadership, right?
hmm
And recognizing that there are going to be I think there's a lot of fear that comes with change,
hmm
and understandably so, but there are also opportunities that are created. And so I think part of, to your point, being future thinking is looking forward and saying, okay, where are the opportunities going to be here? Where's
hmm
that win going to be? Right. And
hmm
then seeking ways to cultivate those opportunities accordingly.
And I agree on the flexibility. It's power, and it's the one thing that is here to stay through COVID. People want it. They've had a taste of it, and they need. And organizations have to find a balance of what's going to work and how can we still keep a team. How do we cultivate relationships and performance, but also give people the opportunity to work from home when they have a sick kid, or if they commute, what days do they need to be in the office and things like that, or things that we've never done before we can think about considering because what we've been doing wasn't working. One of the beautiful things about COVID is that we did learn that we can do a lot of things remotely, and we
Mhm.
don't need to have as many meetings if they're not productive. It can just be a report out. It can just be an email.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It definitely has been an occasion to rethink all of our assumptions.
Right. And I love the idea of rethinking. Speaking of that, have you read Think Again by Adam Grant?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Such
one.
good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that one. Well, I really appreciate it. I have a couple more questions to ask you. Let's just do a fill in the blank. Okay. Leadership.
Sure.
Leadership to you means.
Leadership to me means, so I mean, immediate words that come to mind certainly versatility and flexibility, right? But it's about finding the win. It's about finding the opportunities to advance the work of the people who report to you, right? And in pursuit of organizational goals.
Awesome. Love that. Character to you means.
Doing the same things when in the light of day and when no one's watching.
Yeah, I love that. And one more. Diversity is.
So critically important. And I think something that organizations are now really understanding in its full breadth. I think we've had sort of a surface level understanding of it. Increasingly, I think we've gotten deeper and deeper understandings of why it's important. And I think it's got to be on the agenda for any organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely the way of the future. And there's so much research to support that diverse organizations are much more productive and have much more innovation. And I love seeing that research coming out because it just points to the fact of we should be doing it, but it's also here's the why. Because let's face it, many people focus on the bottom line. But when it shows up on the bottom line and it points to diversity being key in that area, I think that's when people start to really listen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate your time and your willingness to talk to us about negotiation. I would encourage our listeners to check out Idaho State College of Business and some of the courses. The course that he is teaching is through SUIT, which is Continuing Education and Workforce Training, which is not it's not an actual 4-credit course, right? It's a community course. So anybody could take that. You don't need to have any sort of application to get into the university through that program. So I would be taking it. And I actually have somebody that I know that is taking it, and I'm asking them to take some notes. I put it out on my social, and I had somebody like, I'm taking it. I was like, great, let's get together afterwards to debrief. And as soon as as soon as you have more information about your guest and when the talks, the public things, let me know so I can just share that out in case this podcast doesn't drop before the date of February. So thank you so much and Happy New Year. And thank you all for listening to the Leader U podcast and to Dr. Bolinger and his wisdom on decision making and negotiation.